Good. Welcome everybody to the APGRD and to a poetry reading by A.E. Stallings. My name's David Ricks, and it's a great pleasure to welcome A.E. Stallings today. Those of you who haven't heard her read before, or worse still, might not yet know her poetry, will see just what a beakerful of the warm south she's going to bring us on this unseasonably cold, by modern standards, late November day. Alicia does tell me there's some high winds in Athens, perhaps released from the sack of Aeolus, which might possibly disrupt internet connectivity at times, as also might the arrival of two small children who are supposed to be sternly kept out of the scene by a note on the door. So let's see, that'll be later. But anyway, time was when there was just one classically resonant poet who went by the prefix A.E. He was a mustachioed gentleman with a rather checkered undergraduate career at St. John's, right opposite the home of APGRD. But things are very different now. Alicia Stallings, whose intellectual and personal journey has taken her from Athens, Georgia to Athens, Greece, and taking in on the way an MST in Latin literature at LMH, A. Stallings is one of the most resourceful and distinctive voices among modern poets with classical, so to speak, receptivity. In fact, the sober-sided formulations, classical reception or classical tradition, don't give us enough sense of how she's a poet who reinvents Greek and Roman themes, new every time, and in constantly surprising ways that make the reader feel clever. Recognition for A.E. Stallings has come in too many forms to be documented here, though, as with a number of the best American poets, she perhaps deserves to be more closely read, more widely appreciated on this side of the Atlantic, at least in Britain, than she is. She is, for starters, a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She received a MacArthur Award, the so-called Genius Awards, back in 2011. And her fourth and most recent book of her own poems, Like, published by Farrar in 2018, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Her poems appear in the best magazines and at a pace which means that she doesn't repeat herself. A. Stallings is a writer who operates on several connected fronts. Her poetry collection since Archaic Smile back in 1999, followed by Hapax, that followed by Olives. Her poetry collections all draw on classical subjects in ways that connect often with other contemporary poetry by women, not least in reading myth and motherhood together, but in a voice that's distinctive and disarming. It was very fitting, I think, that her first collection was the winner of the Richard Wilbur Award. Her erudition, lack of solemnity, and humane vein are very much in that tradition. Just as, to take a different example, her satisfying mordacity owes something to the late Turner Cassidy, an early mentor of hers. But all of this has taken on a distinctively Greek twist that comes from 2 decades of domestic life in and civic commitment to Greece and Athens today. The poet herself has said in an interview, "The ancients taught me to sound modern, how to sound modern. They showed me that technique was not the enemy of urgency, but its instrument." Well, something you'll hear today, and then you can turn to her books or magazines with delectation, is the technical inventiveness and assurance of this poet, delighting in her craft, but wanting something that goes beyond flash and display. Each of her collections has accrued a new area of experience, and Like, her amplest and most recent, employs an alphabetical arrangement of the poems to subsume a very wide and unexpected terrain of moods, times, and forms. And among the key subjects there are the ongoing waves of forced migration that we witness today, migration by sea, of course, and her epigrams on the resultant tragedies, very much in British and French minds this week, of course, take a place, I think, beside Kipling's Epitaphs of the War. And I also commend to the reader who hasn't come across them the numerous and various TLS pieces of reportage from Greece in the same vein. Particular importance and, of course, relevance to APGRD today is A. Stallings' productivity in and formation by translation and ambitious translation projects of her own. Her version of Lucretius's The Nature of Things appeared with Penguin Classics in 2007, and it must be the first work on that scale written in 14ers since Chapman's Iliad spoke out loud and bold. In 2018, she followed this up with an equally distinctive version of Hesiod's Works and Days, again for Penguin Classics. Foreign poets domiciled in Greece often, it seems to me, turn into lotus eaters, ill-equipped to notice anything much resembling reality, but A. Stallings is not one to look down on Boeotian brass tacks. And most recently, in 2020, and a nice pick-me-up during this odd period we're living through, she published a characteristically ludic version of the Battle of the Frogs and Mice, with illustrations by Grant Silverstein. Of it, Andrew Malenko wrote in the London Review of Books, "It shouldn't be so rare for a poet to be serious and to sparkle at the same time." I do just want to mention one more facet of A. Stallings' aptitude, and I very much hope her future productions, and that's her recourse to and her translations from Greek poetry as it's been in recent periods, not least when it engages with an ancient past that's never straightforwardly past. Here, her versions from the great 20th century poet Angelos Sikelianos came like a bolt from the blue a few years ago, and I very much commend her translation, just for starters, of the poem Yannis Keats, at once Odyssean and Keatsian, and you can find that online at the Poetry Foundation, that great treasure of stuff, and also on the British School at Athens YouTube channel in the little series 21 in 21. And more recently, she's produced a version of Sikelianos' poem Calypso's Song. And this sculpture is not quite ready in the poet's view for unveiling today, but watch out for it when it comes along. So on to the reading itself, which I'm sure will be full of characteristic sharp turns and edged paradoxes, and seriousness and sparkle. The poet has very kindly agreed to be open to a few questions afterwards, and those can be posted in the chat. But please, just as you wouldn't eat crisps during an exquisite recital, don't post anything in the chat while she's actually speaking, but just wait till that period is finished. And then, because this is on YouTube, this event, not Zoom, I'll then ventriloquize the questions to go to Alicia Stallings. So over to you, Alicia. We greatly look forward to this, and it's your show.
Thank you so much, Professor Rix. It's wonderful to be here. I was hoping to be in person at this point, but as we know, we're in very changeable times. So it's wonderful to be connecting here from Athens. And I have been recently, I'm making a selected poem, a book of selected poems, and one of these milestones in a poet's career. And so it's been interesting to look back over all of the poems from the first book and to the poems that I'm writing now, and where some themes are repeated or developed. You see some of the beginnings very early on. I was looking at my first book, Archaic Smile, and realized I think the first 12 poems are about the underworld, and maybe the first 30 poems are about death in some sense. And a lot of them about Greece, but are written really before moving to Greece. And then this last 2 decades where I have been living in Athens during sort of extraordinary times, really. I mean, from the point we moved here, there was excitement about the Olympics. There was excitement about joining the Euro and becoming truly European, and seeing that all kind of dashed and going through the economic crisis and austerity and riots, and then this new crisis, the refugee crisis, which really just follows on and is part and parcel in some ways of these other crises, in as much as they are crises. So I'm going to read somewhat in chronological order, partly because that's easiest with how the books are done. And I'm largely going to be exploring some of the themes as they weave through the books. So this is the very first poem from the very first book, A Postcard from Greece. It is when I was a visitor to Greece and was not a resident of Greece. It's a sonnet. And anyway, here we go. A postcard from Greece. Hatched from sleep, as we slipped out of orbit round a clothespin curve new watered with the rain, I saw the sea, the sky as bright as pain, that outer space through which we were to plummet. No guardrails hemmed the road, no way to stop it. The only warning here and there a shrine, some tended still, some antique and forgotten, empty of oil, but all were consecrated to those who lost their wild race with the road and sliced the tedious sea once like a knife. Somehow we struck an olive tree instead. Our car stopped on the cliff's brow, suddenly safe. We clung together, shade to pagan shade, surprised by sunlight, air, this afterlife. So I think looking back on this, it seems appropriate that this is the sort of the beginning poem of this poetic trajectory, that it's in modern Greece, that it's in a sonnet. A sonnet is, of course, a very good way of, a postcard is, of course, fits very well with a sonnet, being kind of square and transportable. And that it also has this idea of ancient Greece and modern Greece kind of leaking in and out of each other. So I'm kind of surprised in some ways about how these poems continue to kind of speak in different ways. And in some ways I do believe in poetry as a kind of prophecy, not necessarily that it predicts the future, but that it speaks to the future in kind of strangely intelligent ways. So this is a second poem from that book, again, written, this one was written when I was very young. In fact, it was written in London when I was working briefly at the Institute of Classical Studies, and I was serving tea. And it is very much modeled on, I see now, I'm not sure I saw it then, on Browning's To His Last Duchess. And it is called Hades Welcomes His Bride. So this is the second poem in the first book, again, pulling us further and further into the underworld, the afterworld. Come now, child, adjust your sight, your eyes, for sight is here a lesser sense. Here you must learn directions through your fingertips and feet and map them in your mind. I think some shapes will gradually appear. The pale things twisting overhead are mostly roots, although some worms arrive here clinging to their dead. Turn here. And in this hall will sit our thrones, and here you shall be queen, my dear, the queen of all men ever to be born. No smile? Well, some solemnity befits a queen. These thrones I have commissioned to be made are unlike any you imagined. They glow of deep black diamonds and lead, subtler and in better taste than gold, as will suit your timid beauty and pale throat. Come now, down these winding stairs, the air more still and dry and easier to breathe. Here is a room for your diversions. Here I've set a loom and silk unraveled from the finest shrouds and dyed the richest, rarest shades of black. Such pictures you shall weave, such tapestries. For you, I chose those 3 thin shadows there, and they shall be your friends and loyal maids. And do not fear from them such gossiping as servants usually are wont. They have not mouth nor eyes, and cannot thus speak ill of you. Come, come, this is the greatest room. I had it specially made after great thought, so you would feel at home. I had the ceiling painted to recall some evening sky, but without the garish stars and lurid moon. What, that stark shape crouching in the corner? Sweet, that is to be our bed, our bed. Ah, your hand is trembling. I fear there is, as yet, too much pulse in it. So this book, again, very early book, trying to enlarge my own view. I don't think I can do that. Is prescient, I think, in some ways of a lot of the themes. A lot of the poems are from figures in Greek mythology, and they are dealing with them in certain ways. Most of them, I think, are from the female point of view. This one I enjoyed writing because I thought in some ways it's easier to imagine Persephone's mental state and so forth than to imagine the villain. So that was fun to imagine what the villain is thinking. So in this second book, Hapax, which is Greek for once and once only, and I think my editor wasn't 100% sure about this as a title. And I said, but it's going to look so cool with the H-A-P-A-X, and people will just be intrigued. Anyway, I was given my way. But again, this is dealing with a lot of the same poems and themes and myths, rather. So this is the same myth of Hades abducting Persephone. It's written many, many years later. And I write almost exclusively, I would say, in received forms, which are often something like, a sonnet or a sestina. But in this case, the received form is not a poetic form. That's one of the things I also sort of discovered writing my way through my life, is there are lots of kinds of conventions and conceived forms, received forms that you can push against and play with. So it's exactly the same myth. This is from Persephone's point of view, and it is in a form that many of you will be familiar with in some way from academia or from magazines. First love, a quiz. He came up to me, A, in his souped up Camaro, B, to talk to my skinny best friend, C, and bumped my glass of wine so I wore the fairest stain on my sleeve, D, from the ground in a lead chariot drawn by a team of stallions black as crude oil and breathing sulfur. At his heart, he sported a tiny golden arrow. He offered me A, ride, B, dinner and a movie with a wink at the cliche, C, an excuse not to go back alone to the apartment with its sink of dirty knives, D, a narcissus with 100 dazzling petals that breathe the sweetness as cloying as decay. I went with him because A, even his friends told me to beware. B, I had nothing to lose except my virginity. C, he placed his hand in the small of my back and I felt the tread of honeybees. D, he was my uncle, the one who lived in the half-finished basement, and he took me by the hair. The place he took me to, A, was dark as my shut eyes. B, and where I ate bitter seed and became ripe. C, and from which my mother would never take me wholly back, though she wept and walked the earth and made the bearded ears of barley wither on their stalks and the blasted flowers drop from their sepals. D is called by some men hell and others love. E, all of the above. so it's one of those things as a poet that you can keep re-entering the same river more than twice, you know, but you do get these different poems out of them. This Hapax also is written entirely from when I am living in Athens. So I think, you know, that's kind of even reflected in the cover. You've got this Corey here on the cover of Archaic Smile, and here we have a Greek icon on the cover of Hapax. And, you know, this is, I'm putting more things about modern Greece and Athens in the poems. And so there's a way where I'm trying to keep up to date with what is happening in my life while also interpreting, you know, the myths in maybe in different kinds of ways. So it's a way where I'm trying to continue to mix things in with what is happening around me. This poem was written, there was a wonderful exhibit of all the discoveries made during the construction of the Athens Metro. And I'm really very fond of very specific and strange museum exhibits. I can get overwhelmed, you know, in a huge museum with all the masterpieces and so on, but I love everyday objects. So this is a poem about looking at an ancient dog grave. It's called An Ancient Dog Grave Unearthed During Construction of the Athens Metro. And I think it sort of explains itself, but I was really taken by these evil eye beads on the collar, which, you know, people still put on animals, dogs and horses to this day. It is not the curled up bones, nor even the grave that stops me, but the blue beads on the collar, whose leather has long gone the way of hides, the ones to ward off evil. A careful master even now protects a favorite just so. But what evil could she suffer after death? I picture the loyal companion, bereaved of her master, trotting the long, dark way that slopes to the river, nearly trampled by all the nations marching down, one war after another, flood or famine, her paws sucked by the thick, colliginous mud deep as her dew claws near the riverbank. In the press for the ferry, who will lift her into the boat? Will she cower under the pier and be forgotten, forever howling and whimpering, tail tucked under? What stranger pays her passage? Perhaps she swims, dog paddling the current of oblivion. A shake as she scrambles ashore sets the beads jingling, and then that last tense moment, touching noses once, twice, 3 times with unleashed Cerberus. So my third book, Olives, and I was really adamant that I had to get this pot on the cover of the book, and I'm lucky to have wonderful editors who, you know, help me along with my whims. And I love how the pot goes around the book. And it visited here in Athens some years ago, so I got to go and visit my olives pot. So again, this is a lot of poems that are set now in Greece, because again, I think I've processed some of that experience more. It's also full of things that have to do with motherhood and my children, but there are also some ways in which a lot of these themes continue and return. This is another sonnet, Deus ex machina. And there are a lot of poems of marital strife. It turns out that having a quarrel with my husband is a good way to be inspired to write a poem. Deus ex machina. Because we were good at entanglements, but not resolution, and made a mess of plot, because there was no other way to fulfill the ancient prophecy, because the will of the gods demanded punishment, because neither recognized who the other was, because there was no difference between a tragic ending and a comic scene, because the play was running out of time, because the mechanism of the sublime to stay in working order needed using, because it was a script not of our choosing, because we were actors, because we knew for a fact we were only actors because we could not act. a character that also filters through a lot of the poems, and in some ways to me is part and parcel with even Greek mythology. I feel that Alice in Wonderland is a catabasis. It in some ways plays very much into these archetypes and so on. And so for me, Wonderland is another underworld or afterworld, and also going through the looking glass. So she comes in quite a lot also. This is Alice in the Looking Glass. It is a sonnet again. And it's a mirrored sonnet. So the last line rhymes with the first line, and so on until the middle. But the rhymes are not audible rhymes. They are not I rhymes. They are conceptual rhymes. So, front would rhyme with back, black with white. So it'll be very hard to listen to them. But again, it was a really exciting constraint to work with. So Alice in the Looking Glass. No longer can I just climb through. The time is past for going back, but you are there, still conning books in Hebrew right to left, or moving little jars on the dresser top like red and white pieces on a chessboard. Still, you look up curiously at me when I pass, as if you'd ask me something, maybe why I've kept you locked inside. I'd say, because that is where I'd have reflections stay in surfaces where they cannot disquiet, shallow for all that they seem deep at bottom, though it's to you I look to set things right, the blouse askew, hair silvering here and here, where everything reverses, save for time. Like, which is the most recent book, also is the thickest book. That's not necessarily a direction I want to keep going in, but it is. And in this one, it's not done by sort of movements. A lot of poetry books are in, sections, almost like movements. I just wanted to throw things into alphabetical order. I think we've been talking a lot about the alphabet with these variations of the virus. And I just threw things in alphabetical order, and they just sort of magically seem to speak to each other in different kinds of ways. And in the very few cases where a poem did not really fit, I changed the title, but I only did that with like 2 poems, so it's not so different. So, and again, there's a lot of characters that are in here. There's an Alice bewildered poem. Deep in the woods where things escape their names, her childish arm drapes round the fawn's soft neck, her diffidence, its skittishness in check, merged in the anonymity that tames. She knits her brow, but nothing now reclaims the syllables that meant herself. Ah, well, she need not answer to the grown-up beck and call, the rote-learned lessons, scolds and blames of girlhood, sentences to pars and gloss. She's untwinned from the likeness in the glass. Yet in the dark ellipsis, she can tell, she's certain that her name begins with L. Liza, Lacey, alias, alas, alas, alike, alone, and at a loss. So she keeps coming into the poems. And of course, my name is a version of Alice. It's a diminutive of Alice. The Minotaur has also appeared in a number of poems, as well as the Labyrinth, through the various books. And this is a version called Art Monster. My mother fell for beauty, although it was another species, ox-eyed, dew-lapped, groomed for sacrifice. She had to devise another self to put herself in. Something inhuman or beauty could not possess her. Odidal mechanics. She grew huge with hybridity. Rumor ripened. I was born to be amazed. She fascinated me with cat's cradles, spun threads out of my hirsute hair shirt. I was fed on raw youths and maidens when all I wanted was the cud of clover. I was named after my stepfather, dispenser of judgment. No one called me my mother's son. Minotaur, they asked, oh Minotaur, you are unnatural, grotesque, A hero will come to slay you, a hero who jilts princesses on desert islands. It is heroic to slay, to break a heart, to solve the archaic puzzle in the basement, demonster the darkness. I await this patiently as I bow to the yoke of making, scratching this earliest of inscriptions on a potsherd down here in the midden, writing left to right, then right to left, as a broken beast furrows a field. This book was also one, and there are poems where the tear gas comes in from the very first poem here. I wanted to have things like tear gas and riots be able to blow through the poems that are also about ancient Greece and modern Greece. I really, living here during these crises, there was this sense of everything being overlaid everything else, of a kind of continuum, where during the riots and protests against austerity, there are all these words that Hesiod is using. I mean, exactly the same words, kreos, debt. This idea of shaking off the burden of debt that was coming through from Solon. The idea that austerity is litotes. For me, as a poet and a foreigner living here, just feeling that all of these things were in conversation. The refugee crisis, I became fairly directly involved with volunteering, meeting boats that were coming into Piraeus with hundreds to thousands of people. And Piraeus went, from a few tents to a tent city. People had walked just right out of basically, war or other crises. And this feeling, again, first of all, of resonance with 1922, when you had this exchange of populations and so many people coming from what is now modern Turkey to Greece, ethnic Greeks, again, tent cities and Piraeus and other places. But also this sense that the people who are coming, there was this sense of Greece trying to be in Europe with the euro and so on, and kind of failing. And then realizing that, no, look at Greece, where it is geographically, people coming here from Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Syria, parts of Africa. This is really the ancient Greek world, isn't it? And it's also kind of the Hellenic world, and this idea that these are a lot of the place names people were talking about could be out of a Cavafy poem as well. So there was this sense of that, and it caused me to start rereading or re-understanding poems like the Iliad, where I think as an undergraduate, first reading the Iliad, in translation before I really had any Greek to speak of, the place names kind of wash over you, the geography washes over you. And then rereading it, realizing that all of these events that happen right before the Iliad that really trigger it are really about Achilles' raids around this bay of Edremit and Lesbos. And that's where all of the problems really start. And that this is where the boats are coming from. They are coming to Lesbos from the Bay of Edremit. And it's exactly the same places, that Briseis and Chryseis is from, and, where Achilles is enslaving people and people who are fleeing ISIS and enslavement and so forth. And just realizing that, as Faulkner says, the past isn't dead, it isn't even past. And how to get these into poems without, exploiting other people's experience. And I decided I had to write about it from the point of view of a foreign woman living in Greece who has studied classics. So, not to absorb other people's experience, but to explain how I'm feeling. And one of the things was realizing how many people are drowning. How many people are drowning in the Aegean? One morning, I'm going to take my children to school, and I see on the local Facebook feed, not necessarily national or international news, 40 people, mostly children, have died in one or two incidents, off of a couple of islands, and realizing that's an entire classroom full of people. And this is the same sea that my children are playing with and making their sandcastles in. So that was quite something to try to process. And I was a little suspicious about how do you write about this. So this poem, Empathy, kind of comes out of how do you write about this? Empathy. My love, I'm grateful tonight. Our listing bed isn't a raft, precariously adrift, as we dodge the Coast Guard light and clasp hold of a girl and a boy. I'm glad we didn't wake our kids in the thin hours to take not a thing, not a favorite toy, and didn't hand over our cash to one of the smuggling rackets, that we didn't buy cheap life jackets, no better than bright orange trash and less buoyant. I'm glad that the dark above us is not deeply twinned beneath us, unmoiled with wind, and we don't scan the sky for a mark, any mark that demarcates a shore as the dinghy starts taking on water. I'm glad that our 6-year-old daughter, who can't swim, is a foot off the floor in the bottom bunk, and our son with his broken arms high and dry, that the ceiling is not seeping sky with our journey but hardly begun. Empathy isn't generous, it's selfish. It's not being nice to say, I would pay any price not to be those who die to be us. David was kind to mention some of the epigrams. That was another thing, again, I think processing every day. Maybe the world saw one child washed up on a beach, but I saw a lot of children washed up on beaches, which I did not share. But, just looking at like the clothes would be the same clothes I would be dressing my children in, it was just, and how to write about that. And I think the epigram is a very good way of dealing with things that are undealable with. And the fact that it does fit in this idea of the Greek anthology, so many people die by drowning. It was a way to put some irony, some ironic distance in what is really kind of unbearable. So I might read a couple of these and then perhaps a few uncollected new poems, and then maybe we'll have some questions. So these are it's part of a larger section, which I called Refugee Fugue, which has a number of different kinds of poems. These are called Aegean epigrams. And there's a epigraph from Aeschylus's Agamemnon. We behold the Aegean blossoming with bodies. And this is also, there are several reasons why I picked that. The Aeschylus in the Greek is quoted around this time that these drownings are happening on the island of Lesbos by the person who runs the university there, whose name I forget. But he quotes this, in this way in Greek, which is therefore also quoting it out of the Sepphoris poem. So there's this way of it echoing through time and speaking, through Sepphoris and then through Aeschylus, and now speaking to these bodies in the Aegean. So I'll read a few of these. The woman from Leros. The woman from Leros said, small bodies wash ashore, sea-chewed, a few days dead. I don't eat fish anymore. And again, some of these are just anecdotes from things people would told me. Duties. Which one seems more chilling? Copenhagen willing to confiscate cash and bauble from Mosul, Homs, and Kabul, or smugglers making a killing, palming Charon's obol. Fathomless. A fathom deep the body lies, beyond all helps and harms, unfathomable, unfathomable, the news repeats like charms, forgetting that to fathom is to hold within your arms. Paradox. Of the ones that happen to die, the little ones and the old, by hypothermia or drowning, all died of cold. Nothing to declare. As if in a sea of red tape, the faulty life jackets tossed. There is no custom house, no guards at the borders, these have crossed. And the last one of these, proposed epitaph for drowned refugee children, which is a kind of take on Simonides. Go tell the bureaucrats, passerby, that all is shipshape, fine. The stuff that trickles from your eye is only a little brine. And I think I might have time for one or two more newer ones. David can stop me if that is not the case. So again, now as these are poems that are after like, so they're poems that the life jackets will come into the Aegean, even in some of the ancient poems, poems about the ancient Aegean and so on. There's this, again, feeling of porousness through time, and how to write about things, how to write about news in the newspaper and so on. This was one where there was a news item of a young Turkish violinist who drowned on the Aegean crossing, April 24th, 2017. And this is a case where I actually know the name of this person. It's in memoriam of Barış Yazgi, and it has been translated into Turkish. So I kind of hope it gets back to this person's family. So again, I think you'll see there's this idea of where Lesbos is now, and of what this crossing entails, and what the resonances are. Reports said you were found clutching the case containing your instrument as well as music of your own composition. You knew what it was to place faith in a hollow wooden vessel, carried on waves, lilting in harmonic motion, scales like water running through your fingers. I think of Arion of Lesbos and his harp, saved by a dolphin in the legend, of accidentals flat and sharp, of pitch and yaw. I think of the deep sound of the bow rolling across arpeggios, no bridge, but the violin's bridge. And if I have time, I would read a last one. Is that okay? Okay. I thought I might end on an underworld poem that is slightly not more upbeat, but so as we've been doing a lot of these Zoom visits to classes, and the poet and classicist Rachel Haddis had invited me at one point to visit her class on Zoom to talk about book 11 of the Odyssey, again, which is this descent into the underworld where we talk to all of the shades, which I think is also a wonderful fan fiction thing of, we want to see what happened to so-and-so, and we want to talk to so-and-so, and, they can't be in the poem proper. But it just also occurred to me that these Zoom meetings really are like a Nakia, in the sense that we're all kind of images, kind of flimsy images, and we're talking to people across all kinds of time and distance. So this is a somewhat humorous poem in that mode. So a ghost among the ghosts who meet on Zoom. I am the guide, and I must read the room, explaining the underworld to these fresh shades, unwedded youths and newly sorrowed maids, a glass in hand, the sanguine hue of blood. I hope my speaking will be understood, describing what in Hades may be seen, distanced and virtual as on a screen. First Elpenor, hazed frat boy on a souse who tumbled from the roof of Animal House. And always someone's mother's sacrifice has ended here. You'll try to hug her thrice. Here's Agamemnon, phantom who was haunted. He did not get the welcome home he wanted. And there's Achilles buried with such glory, who'd rather be alive without the story. Better to be a nobody instead of somebody among the flimsy dead. He strides off beaming, though, in a long lope. News of his son thriving above brings hope. It's time to log off now as ghosts swarm thick in sums confounding our arithmetic. When last of all, the friend steps from the throng, we owe atonement for an ancient wrong. That Ajax, frowning, hulking like a brute, whose huge resentment no one can unmute. Thank you.
Well, many thanks. We're most grateful for a very rich conspectus of what you've been doing in poetry for more than a quarter of a century, and very generously taking us up to things which are hot from the press. And I can only feel a pang that I don't anymore teach my course on the descent to the underworld, that I could have this last poem as a nice little pendant to the rest. So this is a very, very interesting sample, a cross-section of things that A. Stallings has been doing over the years, and with plenty more to come. As I said, she's very generously agreed to field a handful of questions if there are particular things that people would like to feed into the chat and for me to point to her. I hope not impertinently, while we're just waiting for them to come through. I've just got one question about this enticing prospect of a selected poems that's coming about, and that's always a rite of passage for a poet. Presumably this will be a new and selected, will it, or no? So just
no, there was some talk about a new and selected. My editor Jonathan Galassi at FSG felt that that is not always a good move. So it's really kind of a pure selected, but it's a selected with some uncollected poems. So I'm trying to give people a little something extra with the selected, and realize that there were some poems that I hadn't booked over the years that I felt were actually bookable poems. But for some reason, maybe there was a repetition of theme, or I felt too many sonnets or something, I hadn't included. So there will be a kind of little extra section, but I think the idea is to hold the new poems for just a purely new book, but it will also come out with Carcanet. So it's in theory going to come out on both sides of the pond, and was supposed to come out last year, I think, but it was not a great year for publishing. So I'm glad that we've waited, and I've had a little bit more time to think about what to include and what not. I mean, there's this sense of you want to include things that are popular and that are greatest hits, and but you also think this is a kind of retrospective, and you want it to be your strongest work, and to look on it with a cold eye. So it's been a bit of a juggling act with that.
Very interesting. Well, we look forward to that, and as you say, coming with Carcanet, so with a British version, exactly. So we have a question through, couple coming through. One from Daniel Clarwitter, asking if you'd like to say anything about the reason you avoid having blurbs from other poets on the back of your books. And is there a clue in the anti-blurb that you put on the back cover of Hapax?
Well, I mean, to be honest, I just think I'm not sure that anyone buys a book of poems based on the blurbs. I don't know. I think maybe they made more sense in another time, but I think now there's so many teaching and MFA programs, and there's so much blurbage going on. I mean, I think it can mean something. You see, oh, this person has been blurred by so and so and so and so, whom I like, so maybe I will like their work. But also it could just mean that they studied with them, or and I don't do a lot of blurbing on poetry books myself. Partly, I feel like I do my literary citizenship in other ways. I do a lot of book reviewing and letters of reference and so forth. And I find the blurbage, it's overheated, so I can even read that for you if you like. There's sort of do we have blurbs on the selected? Do we put anti-blurb on the back? I'm not sure. This is anti-blurb, and it doesn't exist in the book itself. It's a little extra thing. This is not necessary. This is neither crucial nor salvation. It is no hymn to harmonize the choirs of seraphim, nor any generation's bold bellwether leading the flock. No iridescent feather dropped from the muse's wing. It does not limn or speak in tongues or voice the mute or dim outmoded theories with its fireworks. Rather, this is flawed and mortal, and its stains bear the evidence of taking pains. It did not have to happen, won't illumine the smirch of history, the future's omen. Necessity is merely what sustains. It's what we do not need that makes us human. I thought that would be more fun than other people talking about my work. I think it shows you what will be inside.
Thank you. That's a nice bonus, and as well as a vivid protest against the world of blurbage, as you put it. Second questions come in it's a broad question, but why not? It reads as follows. Form is obviously very important to you. Can you say when it comes to you? Does it come with the theme, or does it come after the theme, or does it come alchemically with the theme?
I think different poems arrive in different ways. Generally, especially when I'm talking about rhyme, which I think is a sort of much misunderstood and maligned English tool. I think there's, and in fact, this often happens with reviews of my work. There will be a point in the review where someone says, I like what this poem says, but, if only it didn't have to rhyme. Whereas for me, rhyme is usually the way that I work out the poem. It's to me, a method of sort of feeling my way. I've talked about it as with echolocation or something. It's a way of feeling my way through my thoughts. But there are cases where there has been a theme. So, in general, I'm not versifying some thought that I've already had. That would be extremely boring to me. It's okay if I'm translating a thought someone else has had, but to me, that's not very interesting. I like that idea of being surprised, the writer being as surprised as the reader. But there are some cases of poems which I wanted to write about that thing, and I have had to experiment with the form that was right for it. So in that sense, the theme, or there's a new book actually by Dan Brown about subject in poetry, which I'm finding very interesting. That subject maybe rather than theme, and trying it as a sonnet, and that doesn't work, and trying it as a blues poem, and maybe that works, or trying it as a sestina, and I just keep casting about in different ways, maybe trying it in free verse. So I think it can work either way. Generally, I like to feel that the form is part of the discovery, but there are some cases where the form solved another problem that I was having with a previously existing poem.
I'm just following on from that. You just mentioned your activity as a translator, and the fact that in some way, especially if you're dealing with a vast synthesis like Lucretius's poem, takes you away from having to think up new ideas of your own. How do you see this vocation of poetry on the one hand and translation on the other sitting together? Does it fit comfortably, or does it sometimes, it's an obvious, in one sense, competition for time, but does it ever conflict in further ways than that?
No, I think it's the opposite of conflicting. I mean, I feel that they're sort of two sides of the same coin or process. Writing being maybe a kind of reading, and translating being a kind of reading, and vice versa. I think what's really wonderful about translation for the poet, or for anyone maybe, but particularly for verse translation for the poet, is you're not in that constant state of anxiety, when you sit down to write, oh my gosh, I have to write something of genius, or what is the point of any of this? You have that kind of pressure taken off, in the sense that you can always sit down and work. And there's this way, I think, people talk about finding your voice as a poet. Of course, the problem is, once you found the voice, how do you get rid of it? The pleasure of translation is you can be another gender, another person, another time, coming from a different culture. There's this way of exploring themes that you maybe would never explore in your own work, that will, of course, eventually, in some ways, perhaps percolate through your work. I think they work very well together. And I generally do feel a bit at a loss, I think, if I don't have some sort of translation thing to tinker with in the background. I really feel that they very much feed into and off of each other. And, I think translating, most of my translation career, such as it is, has been with longer poems. I myself write very short poems for the most part, but it has taught me a little bit about how to write a longer poem. So I have been able to write longer poems kind of seeing the nuts and bolts of how that works, with Lucretius, for instance, how, just when you despair of getting into something so technical, there will be this wonderful window thrown open of a example, which in Lucretius functions like an epic simile does in Homer, of this window into the domestic world, or to a world that everybody understands and sees and can imagine. And it's really about every 40 lines. It never goes more than 40 lines without something wonderful. So you can kind of hold on through the really technical stuff if you can get to this sort of reward, this spoonful of sugar that helps the medicine go down. So I love translating poets who are, there has to be some kind of chemistry, I think. If you have no chemistry with that work, if you can't figure a way into it, then that is not pleasurable or fun. But I think some of the chemistry can be a little bit in opposites attract. It doesn't necessarily have to be someone in any way like myself. So for me, it's a very rich area that feeds into everything else.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, which it comes from Rowena Fowler, who spends a lot of time thinking about this sort of thing very productively. And after thanking you for a wonderful reading, she then wants to ask about the spectral sonnet form that gives the poem The Battle of Plataea Aftermath its structure. She says, you don't often work with ancient prose writers. Do you find poetic forms a fruitful way to respond to them?
Thank you for that question. I think if I had to name this kind of sonnet, so the Battle Plataea is just little wonderful anecdotes out of Herodotus, sort of ripe for versification. This is a case where I'm versifying essentially prose, as of course Lucretius does as well. I guess it's kind of Hellenistic move to versify prose, where I felt like these kind of work as sonnets. In fact, this had to do with a movie I was working on about the road to Sparta with Barney Spender, and I was commissioned to write sonnets about this, the marathon and the road to Sparta. And so of course I was looking back into Herodotus and I was thinking, well, this kind of is like a sonnet and this is kind of like a sonnet. So that's kind of where some of the inspiration comes from. But then putting them as if they are prose poems. And I think there have been some reviews that kind of didn't get the trick of that. They were sort of upset that there are all these random rhymes in this prose poem. I think Josh Megan is the inventor of this kind of prose poem sonnet, and I call it a Megan sonnet, but I like the idea of spectral sonnet as well. And I think it was part of it. I'm writing about these anecdotes, or writing these anecdotes that are from kind of the father of prose, if you will. And I wanted them to look like prose and be blocky as prose, and to look like Herodotus. But at the same time, I enjoyed the fact that they worked both ways, that they do scan and they do rhyme. And I like to be able to read them both ways, read it straight as prose, or you could read them as lineated sonnets. So that was a kind of technical issue that I really enjoyed wrestling with. And I think, it kind of worked in this really strange way. And it was a way of, again, dealing with these battles and so on that are still very much in the fore in the mind with all of the anniversaries that have come around. So I'm not sure if I really answered that question, but for me it was playing with prose rhythms where it actually also technically scanned, and how far I could push that without it completely falling apart. I'm not sure if they all succeeded, but I really enjoyed doing them.
Thank you. Well, once again, you've taken us right into your workshop, and that's something which is always very welcome, and sometimes poets are perhaps understandably reticent about doing that, but it's been most illuminating. Likewise, your very articulate way of sketching for, in some cases, a new audience here, what the relationship is between the ancient and the modern, and the personal and the collective in your project, now running for a quarter of a century. We're extremely grateful. It's going to cause a lot of interest in our APGRD circles, people who have been prevented by snow, class, or fatigue, or phobia of SARS-CoV-2 or some other reason from turning up today will have access to a recording of the event. But on behalf of all of us at APGRD, we're really very grateful for what's been an inspiring presentation of your work, and we await with pleasure the thought of the selected poems coming soon. So many thanks. Inaudible applause coming through on this cold YouTube Nekia-like medium. Lots of applause for Alicia Stallings for a really absorbing reading. Thank you so much. And we
Thank you so much for having me.